We're moving through the 6 essential cogwheels of brain health, and we're now up to the cogwheel that we used to call socialization, and then we called it social connections, and now it's social engagement, and that's kind of fine-tuning the basic premise that people are social animals, that social connections are important, and that a phrase that I took from Andrew Weil was isolation is fatal.
Yeah, it's really important. We are social animals, and we can look at our own behavior the way ethologists and sociobiologists look at animal behavior. And one of the things that's very clear, say in experiments with rats, rats are social animals as well. If they put rats in a cage by themselves, they become chronically stressed, just because they're not
of the isolation from others.
Yeah, and just putting them back in a cage with other rats lowers the whole stress level, and I think that applies for human beings as well.
It really does, and one of the first studies that we saw come out was one about 20 years ago that made the front cover of Time magazine, and that was the famous nun study. And the nun studies that socialized, the nuns that socialized and engaged in cognitive activities, and that they seemed to be thriving as they aged. And this longitudinal study, which is study over sometimes generations, was conceived in a way to track people as they aged. And one of the components that Snowden, who created this, put in was to take the pathology of the brain after death and have that autopsied, so that we're looking to see whether or not there are clues to plaques, tangles, what you can find within the pathology. And what they found was that some of those nuns that had the hallmarks of Alzheimer's and dementia didn't have the symptoms. How could that be?
Well, Sister Bernadette was one of the examples. She always was the top of her class. Whenever they gave the cognitive test, she did perfectly. When they autopsied her brain, she died of a heart attack, I think, about age 82. When they did her autopsy, her brain was full of the plaques and tangles, that with the pathology. Where this led to was the whole idea of the reserve theory, that your brain...
Because she didn't have the symptoms.
Right, she did not.
And they couldn't figure out how the theory of plaques and tangles must be causing the symptoms of Alzheimer's. She didn't have the symptoms.
Right. Sister Matthias lived to something like 102, perfectly healthy, but when they looked at her brain, she had what the equivalent of mild to severe Alzheimer's, according to the pathologies, but she didn't behave properly.
And Michael, this is what stunned the Alzheimer's scientific research community, because they had theorized that you had to have those symptoms if the pathology is there. Well, this broke the mold. How could it be? Could they have postponed the symptoms even though the pathology might have taken hold?
Yeah, and part of the theory is that you build up a reserve of healthy brain cells and healthy cognitive abilities, and socialization probably is one of the social engagement is probably one of the things that does that. And this is an important point. You link it back to physical exercise, mental exercise. When you're out and engaging with people, you're moving.
There's a book that we've been looking at for years. A decade ago, Jerome Kagan from Harvard wrote a book called Surprise, Uncertainty, and Mental Structure. And we took that title and applied some of his ideas to older brains, and we explained it to people this way, that if you have no surprise and you have no uncertainty in your life, your mental structure is at risk. If you have surprise, pleasant surprise and uncertainty, something you cannot predict, your brain structure seems to be staying together, and you don't have the symptoms that you might have if you're in a stagnant life with nothing that is going to surprise you.
And what's the most surprising and unpredictable?
You are.
Exactly.
Human
people
beings,
are.
Yeah, people. But when the nun study was making headlines, some people said, well, that's not society. That's that's not the general public. So the NIH and the NIA got together, and they put together a study, 1,100 people, men and women, across Chicago, and what it's known as the Rush Aging Study. What they've done over the last 20 years is to monitor, just like the Nun study, monitor what people do, and in particular socialization and lifestyles, and they found the same thing. Those that might have the hallmark plaques and tangles but didn't have the symptoms were, in 2006 when the first studies came out, this quote was in the literature: something seems to be released in the brains of those that socialize with others that masks the symptoms of Alzheimer's and dementia. And when we dissect that, something seems to be released, and it appears that things in the brain, chemicals, something that we may not have discovered, seems to get into the brain and protect those people who socialize with others. And remember, I called you and said, they didn't say, Bennett and Wilson did not say other people. Even though we agree, that's the most surprising other thing.
Right.
But could that mean that pets or plants? So if we think that that's the wave of the future, then we're going to tell people socialize with others. That may be what will mask the symptoms, so that when they do your autopsy, Michael, and they find the plaques and tangles, I'll say, Michael wins, because our goal might be to postpone those symptoms until you die of something else.
Right. Yeah, I think it's an important point that if you don't have people to socialize, get a pet. You know, if you don't have a pet, get a plant. But I wouldn't go quite as far as you say. I mean, don't replace people with pets.
No,
I think
that's
you have
the
to
most
stick
surprising
with people.
thing on it. And the other is that if it's a reason to get up in the morning, if you have a responsibility, and that's why even we work here at PCC with horticulture therapy, a real blooming or exploding type of therapy, and part of it is to have people responsible every day for something that they are giving back, whether it's a plant, a pet, or their friends. So we can't overemphasize the potential of social engagement with others as one of the key elements of a cognitive wheel that works.
Right. One final point before we leave it, and this sort of anticipates the next cogwheel, which is stress management.
Right.
Obviously, toxic, angry, stress-producing social engagement is not productive for you. A little degree of stress, and we'll talk about this more when stress, is good for you, because that forces you to grow. But if you're engaged with somebody who is, clearly is abusive, is physically abusive, emotionally abusive, that is not good for you. So you need to, just that caution when we're talking about social engagement, it's in positive, nurturing and social relationships.
And I am so glad you put that in there, because if all we had said about engage wasn't with that caution, not just for a single person who might be toxic to you in a sense, but what about a group? What if you're in a group of friends who all they talk about are the negative things? I remember when I was working during our clinical trials and as an activity director, and I banned 3 things from the dining hall because I felt that they were negative. And now the research is in. I said, you can't talk about the weather too long, because if you talk about the weather in somewhere with a flood, it's nothing you can do about it. We didn't talk about the food, because unless it was the good, that's for the food committee. Don't gripe about the food at the table. The third one is the most important. We banned the organ recital. We didn't allow anybody, and we jokingly said, don't tell everybody about every organ in your body that's been failing, because it's the negative connections, the social engagement in a negative sense of talking about how bad the world is, or what you just saw on TV and what somebody else saw. When you're with friends, try to get a group of friends that are looking at the bright side and looking at things that they can look forward to. The brain will benefit from that.
Last thing that I just want to, you keep reminding me of things. One of the things that I'm exploring in the book is we are very sensitive to our status within within the hierarchy of our social environment, and by and large, people who feel that they are at the lower status level feel worse than people who are at the upper level. So it's an interesting dynamic in social engagement, is how we relate to where we feel we are in the hierarchy of whatever group we're engaged in.
Well, since we're looking at adding one more thing, do you remember the loneliness study out of Chicago?
Cacciopo, was that?
Cassiopo.
Cassiopo.
Yeah, and what his team has done, and the book is called Loneliness, they have quantified with science that is just brilliant to figure out what is the equivalent of being lonely in risk factors for cognitive decline. And what they concluded was that if someone is lonely or if they perceive themselves to be lonely, that that's as bad for your brain's future as being a heavy smoker or being obese. So if you're, and that's both on the quality of your life and the longevity.
Those are big ones.
Those are big ones. Yeah. So that's why you need to engage with others to break that cycle of loneliness and also to share with others what you've got. So anything else you can think of?
I think that we could go on forever, but we ought to stop.
We'll quit socializing with each other.
That's right.